Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some fascinating stuff today. You ready?
Yeah, always up for a good deep dive. What are we looking at today?
Well, it's all about Donald Trump.
Interesting.
Yes, specifically a potential second term, like
Yep.
2024, 2025.
Okay. Yeah, that's certainly a hot topic these days.
And we found this snippet from a podcast called 2024, 2025 Unplugged.
Unplugged.
Catchy. And it really got us thinking, could another 4 years of Trump actually, reshape America's political landscape?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? It's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, for sure. And the podcast, it breaks it down into these three key pillars.
We're tillers. Okay.
Yeah, to help understand a potential second term.
Makes sense. What's the first one?
Okay, so the first one is all about policy. Like what he did in his first term.
Right.
They highlight some of those big things, like the tax cuts, cracking down on immigration, and his whole America First approach to trade.
Yeah, those were definitely hallmarks of his first term. But how would reviving those policies even play out in a second term? I mean, things have shifted, the landscape's different.
That's a good point. So, let's start with those tax cuts.
Okay, sure.
Some people, they really believe that they really help the economy grow, creating jobs, all that.
Yeah, that's the argument you often hear from supporters, right? That it stimulates investment, puts more money in people's pockets, and ultimately leads to economic growth.
Right. But then you have the critics.
Yeah, the critics would say that those tax cuts primarily benefit the wealthy, further exacerbating income inequality.
Oh, for sure. And they worry about what it does to government revenue.
That's right.
If you're cutting taxes, where's the money going to come from to fund essential services? It's a valid concern.
Definitely. And then there's that whole America First thing.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
America
What
first.
does that even really mean for, let's say, our relationships with other countries? Well, America First, at its core, it prioritizes American interests, right? Whether we're talking about trade deals or foreign policy, it's about putting America's needs first, potentially at the expense of global cooperation.
Yeah, so it's like a big shift from how things were done before. Like less global, more focused on us.
Exactly. It's a move away from that kind of multilateral approach to international relations that characterized, previous administrations.
So if he were to win again and really double down on America first, I mean, could that lead to more conflict?
Well, it's certainly a possibility. If you're prioritizing your own interests above all else, it can create friction with other countries who feel like their needs aren't being considered.
Yeah, totally. Okay, and then the second pillar that the podcast talks about is polarization.
Polarization, right.
It mentions those super divided approval ratings he had. It's kind of like, a flashback to 2016.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like deja vu in some ways, doesn't it? The country was deeply divided then, and it seems like those divisions have only intensified in recent years.
Right. And so the question is, if he came back, would it just make things even worse?
That's the concern, isn't it? Would a second Trump term simply pour fuel on the fire of polarization?
Totally. I mean, it might get his base super fired up.
Oh, absolutely. It would likely energize his base and further solidify their support. But at what cost to the broader political landscape?
That's a good question. Could we even talk to each other anymore?
Yeah.
Could anything actually get done in Washington?
That's a real danger. If political polarization continues to escalate, it could lead to even more gridlock, an inability to compromise, and ultimately a breakdown in our ability to govern effectively.
It's kind of like what we saw back during the civil rights movement.
Oh, interesting comparison.
All that social and political upheaval, it created some serious polarization. And it really shaped things for years and years after.
You're absolutely right. History shows us that periods of intense polarization can have long-lasting consequences, shaping not only political systems, but also the social fabric of a nation.
Yeah. We got to learn from the past, right? Okay, and then the third pillar from the podcast, those legal battles.
Ah, yes, the legal battles. It's hard to ignore that aspect of things.
They specifically bring up the January 6th charges.
Yeah, those are certainly significant. And then there's the whole issue with the classified documents.
It's a lot, right? And it feels like it could really overshadow everything else if he runs again.
I think it's inevitable that those legal battles would cast a long shadow over a potential campaign.
Totally. I mean, have we ever seen anything like this before? A presidential candidate facing this level of legal scrutiny?
It's certainly unprecedented in modern American history, and it raises so many questions. How would a campaign even function with these legal proceedings happening at the same time? Would it be all consuming, drowning out any discussion of policy or vision for the future?
Yeah, that's a good point. And what happens if, like, even more charges come up? I mean, would it just be a complete distraction?
It's definitely a possibility. And then there's the question of how it would impact voters' perceptions. Would it galvanize support or would it alienate potential voters who are looking for stability and a focus on the issues?
It makes you think. It's like, how does all of this impact, all of us listening?
Well, I think it underscores the importance of staying informed and engaged. These legal battles, they aren't just a sideshow. They have the potential to significantly impact the trajectory of the election and ultimately the direction of the country.
So just to recap, we've got those policy implications, the potential for even more division, and then these legal battles just hanging over everything. It's intense, right?
It's a complex landscape for sure. And, as we've been discussing, it's primarily focused on America, the American political scene.
Right.
But I think it's also crucial to consider the global context.
Oh, yeah. That's something we haven't even touched on yet.
Exactly. I mean, think about all the trends we're seeing worldwide, right? The rise of nationalism, the shifting economic landscape, the power dynamics between different countries, all of that is going to play a role.
It's all connected, huh?
It is. And so here's something to consider. How might those global trends intersect with a potential second Trump term? And what kind of impact could that have on your life, on your community? These are the kind of questions we need to be asking ourselves.
Wow. So it's not just about what happens here in America. It's like the whole world is part of the equation.
Precisely. What happens on the global stage has ripple effects that can be felt everywhere, including right here at home.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's also pretty exciting, right? It makes you want to keep digging, to keep learning. And that's what it's all about.
I agree. Staying curious, staying engaged, and using critical thinking to navigate this complex world we live in.
Absolutely. Well said. All right, folks. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for tuning in.
Always a pleasure. Until next time.